Hey guys, tonight we're walking into a time when Russia still smelled of wood smoke and horse sweat, where the winter air felt like glass against your cheeks and the streets seemed to stretch forever into gray mist. You're standing in the final fragile years of the Tsar's empire, when gilded ballrooms glittered just a few blocks away from tenement rooms so crowded you could smell what your neighbor was thinking. The year is somewhere in the 1910s, and the empire feels like an old carriage wobbling along on cracked wheels still moving forward, but you're pretty sure the next bump is going to snap an axle. And you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I love imagining this sleepy little community scattered all across the map. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets of St. Petersburg, soon to be renamed Petrograd, are thick with slush. The smell of coal clings to your clothes. The factories never sleep even in winter. You pass women lined up outside bakeries, clutching ration cards, their breath puffing out in little white ghosts. It's not that bread is expensive sometimes, it's just not there at all. And yet, somewhere on the other side of the city, aristocrats are sipping tea from porcelain cups, their fingers tapping the table to the beat of a waltz from Vienna. That's the maddening thing, these two worlds coexist, glaring at each other across the gulf of class. The Tsar Nicholas II still clings to the belief that God appointed him to rule. It's a lovely sentiment if you're sitting on a throne, less lovely if you're sitting on an empty stomach. His court is a bubble, and bubbles have a habit of bursting. Historians still argue whether the empire could have survived if Nicholas had been willing to reform earlier, or if the rot was already too deep. But as you walk these streets, you can feel it. The air is charged with a kind of low-grade static. Everyone knows something is coming. The mainstream fact here is that by 1917, Russia was already stretched thin by World War I. Millions dead or wounded, supplies, short morale, lower than the winter sun. Soldiers desert sometimes, walking hundreds of miles home, only to find their villages even poorer than before. And then there's the quirky tidbit: imported lemons. Yes, lemons had become a sort of luxury status symbol in St. Petersburg markets. Nothing says elite detachment from reality quite like flaunting citrus, while the rest of the city is boiling shoe leather for soup. You wander into a tavern, its windows fogged with heat and cheap vodka breath. Inside, whispers pass between factory workers and students. They talk about strikes, about Marx, about that strange bald man in exile whose pamphlets keep popping up like weeds in cobblestone cracks. Every time the door opens, letting in a blast of cold, you glance up, half expecting the Tsar's police to step in. That's the thing. Conversation here is like walking across thin ice. Too much weight, and it cracks. But there's also hope in a restless, feverish way. You feel it in the way people lean in close, lowering their voices, eyes darting toward the window before saying something dangerous. A revolution isn't just about politics. It's about that moment when fear starts losing the arm wrestling match with anger. You see it in the ragged veterans muttering about coming home to nothing. You see it in the young woman rolling her eyes at a priest's sermon about patience in God's plan. You even see it in the grumpy baker who, without saying a word, slips an extra heel of bread into the hands of a child whose shoes are more whole than leather. Every empire thinks it's eternal until the ground starts to shift under its marble floors. The palaces glitter tonight, but the city beneath them is restless. And as you leave the tavern and step back into the slush, you hear a distant rumble. Not thunder, not wagons, but something more human. The sound of footsteps, hundreds of them, moving toward a future nobody fully understands yet. And somewhere out there, the first cracks are already forming. You just don't know yet how wide they'll spread or how deep they'll go, but you will. You wake to the sound of boots on cobblestone, sharp, rhythmic, and too many to count. The air outside your narrow apartment window is thick with frost, and that metallic tang you only notice when snow and soot mingle. It's Petrograd, February 1917, and you're about to step into streets that feel less like a city and more like a pressure cooker about to blow its lid. The bread lines are longer now. You shuffle into one, your scarf pulled up against the cold, listening to the quiet shuffling of feet. Nobody's chatting. There's nothing left to say. The bakery stock runs out before the line even bends toward the door, and you catch yourself staring at the empty shelves through the window like they're a cruel joke. Somewhere in the crowd, a baby cries, the sound thin and raspy, and it's almost a relief when a man at the front yells at a policeman. That's how these things start, not with banners, but with small, sharp moments when patience simply runs out. The mainstream historical fact strikes had been building for months, especially among factory workers. On International Women's Day, tens of thousands took to the streets, not just for bread, but for an end to the war, an end to the Tsar's incompetence, an end to waiting for someone else to fix it. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some of those early protest signs were scrawled on the backs of wallpaper sheets. Paper was scarce, but frustration, that was everywhere. You start following the crowd, partly out of curiosity, partly because it feels safer to move with them than to stand still. There's a rhythm to it, the crunch of boots, the collective exhale of breath into the icy air. Someone starts shouting, "Down with the Tsar," and the words catch on like a spark in dry grass. You pass soldiers stationed along the main avenue, their rifles slung loosely. They're supposed to keep order, but some look away, pretending to adjust their scarves. Historians still argue whether these soldiers were swayed by sympathy or just too cold and exhausted to care. Either way, the wall between people and power has started to crumble. By afternoon, the city feels different. The air is sharper, the sounds louder, the boundaries fuzzier. A streetcar sits abandoned in the middle of the road, its driver gone to join the marchers. At one corner, women from the bread line are linking arms with men in heavy work coats. At another, someone's tipped over a police sled, scattering files across the snow. You step over a piece of paper stamped with the imperial double-headed eagle. Feels almost indecent, like stepping on a flag, but then again, maybe that's the point. The police try to push the crowd back, but the numbers are swelling. It's hard to shove against people who are simply too many, too tired, and too fed up. And it's not just Petrograd anymore. Rumors say Moscow is restless too. You hear someone near you murmur about the Tsar being at the front miles away, blissfully unaware. Or maybe he knows and just doesn't want to come home. Either way, the Empire's little father isn't here, and that absence feels louder than the shouts echoing off the buildings. By nightfall, the city glows in strange patches, street lamps, fires in barrels, the occasional flare from a distant skirmish. The smell of smoke seeps into your clothes, and every time you turn a corner, you find another knot of people huddled and tense, deciding what comes next. You see students scribbling messages to be slipped under doors, runners darting between neighborhoods like the city itself is a living thing whispering to its own limbs. You know the saying about boiling frogs, how they don't notice the water heating until it's too late. This is the opposite. The water's boiling, and everyone's jumping in. Because cold, stagnant water was worse. The slogans grow bolder. Peace bread and freedom rolls off tongues like it's been there all along, waiting for the right day to come out. You see a boy no older than 15, waving a homemade red banner, And you wonder if he even knows what it means, or if it just feels good to wave something in defiance. Late that night, when you finally turn toward home, you notice the bakery window again. Still empty shelves, still a cold dark inside, but there's a strip of paper taped to the glass now. Handwritten. You lean closer and read, "No bread until the Tsar falls." That's not a supply problem anymore. That's a warning. And whether anyone's ready or not, it's one that's about to be answered. Snow drifts lazily through the gray light of early spring, each flake carrying with it a kind of strange electric anticipation. The crowds in Petrograd haven't gone home. The soldiers haven't all gone back to their barracks, and the Tsar, well, he's still nowhere near the city. Into this unsettled stew comes a figure you've only heard about in whispers, his name passed between students and workers like contraband: Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. You don't see him at first, of course. He's been in exile for years, Switzerland of all places, writing essays that feel as if they were dipped in acid and then sharpened to a point, the mainstream historical fact. In April 1917, with the help of the Germans, yes, the same ones Russia was fighting in the war, Lenin was smuggled across Europe in a sealed train car. The Germans figured that if they sent this political matchstick into Russia, he might set the whole place on fire. And a distracted Russia meant a weaker Eastern Front. The quirky tidbit, that sealed train wasn't exactly a fortress. The car was divided into compartments, and technically the Russian passengers and the German guards shared the same air. Lenin even had a chalk line drawn across the floor to mark the border between Russian and German territory. A symbolic gesture, but you can picture him mustache twitching, stepping over it on purpose just to prove a point. Historians still argue whether Lenin was a genius opportunist or simply lucky that Russia's chaos was ready to receive him. Either way, by the time his train clatters into the Petrograd station, his arrival feels almost theatrical. You imagine yourself in the crowd lamps glowing against the dark steam from the train billowing into the cold night, the scent of coal and wet wool thick in the air. When Lenin steps out, his bald head shining under the platform lights, the applause isn't thunderous, but it's steady hungry. People aren't cheering for a man so much as for the possibility he represents. You follow the crowd to the Finland station, where he gives his first speech. His voice is sharper than you expect, cutting through the murmur like a blade. Peace bread land. He says 3 words, like 3 nails hammered into the coffin of the old order. You can feel the temperature in the square shift. These aren't vague promises, these are marching orders. He talks about ending the war, immediately giving land to the peasants, handing power to the Soviets, the workers' councils springing up like mushrooms after rain. The city seems to tilt after that. Conversations change. It's no longer just about anger at the Tsar. It's about an entirely new system. One where the provisional government, those fragile men in suits trying to patch the empire together, becomes irrelevant. You see their posters peeling on walls, replaced with crude but striking prints of red flags and raised fists. You overhear factory workers debating Lenin's ideas in break rooms, their voices low but urgent. At the docks, sailors lean against crates, passing around pamphlets that smell of cheap ink. Even your neighbor, the one who usually only talks about his samovar's stubborn whistle, suddenly wants to discuss the dictatorship of the proletariat over tea. It's unsettling how quickly an idea can leap from print to conversation to conviction. Still, not everyone is convinced. Some mutter that Lenin's return feels too convenient, that no true patriot would accept help from an enemy in wartime. You see this tension play out in a small, telling moment, a group of soldiers tearing down a red banner in one street, while 2 blocks over another group hoists one up. The city is no longer divided into rulers and ruled, it's fractured into dozens of loyalties, each louder than the last. That night, walking home through the thin snow, you pass the Finland station again. The square is empty now. The crowd gone, but the echo of his speech seems to linger in the air. It's not a comforting echo. It's sharp, almost metallic, like the ring a hammer leaves on steel. Lenin isn't promising you safety. He's promising you a different kind of danger, one that comes with the thrill of tearing down and the risk of what replaces it. And as you turn the corner toward your building, you can't shake the feeling that this man didn't just step off a train. He stepped into the center of the storm, and the wind is already shifting in his favor. The snow has mostly melted now, leaving Petrograd's streets streaked with mud and the smell of damp brick. Whatever fragile calm existed after February is gone, replaced by a hum, low constant, and impossible to ignore. You hear it in the clatter of factory gates closing for yet another strike, in the tense exchanges between soldiers at tram stops, in the hurried pace of messengers darting across the bridges. The city isn't waiting anymore. It's choosing sides. At first, the division is simple enough in name. The Reds who back Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and everyone else the Whites, a loose patchwork of monarchists, Republicans, moderate socialists, and anyone else not sold on the Bolshevik vision. But reality isn't so tidy. You can walk a single block and find a sailor shouting about workers' liberation, a shopkeeper muttering about restoring order, and a student who insists the only answer is a parliament. It's like watching a deck of cards thrown into the wind, no telling where each will land. The mainstream fact. After the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, civil war erupted almost immediately, stretching from 1918 to 1922. It wasn't just a fight between two neat armies. It was a swirling mess of shifting fronts, foreign interventions, peasant uprisings, and personal vendettas. The quirky tidbit. Some parts of Siberia saw more flags change over the same town in a single month than most places see in a century. Reds, Whites, local warlords, even Czech legionnaires on their way east. People joked that you needed a collection of armbands just to stay alive. Historians still argue whether the Civil War was inevitable after the revolution or if it was a direct result of Bolshevik overreach. But on the ground, it doesn't feel like a historical debate. It feels like quicksand. You can't walk anywhere without seeing signs of the split. Railway stations are barricaded food convoys guarded by men who glance at your hands to see if you're carrying the right papers. Graffiti blooms on walls. Long live the Red Army in one street, save Russia from the Bolsheviks in the next. You find yourself on the edge of a rally in the field of Mars. Red banners ripple in the wind like tongues of flame, and speakers shout about smashing the old order. Across the square, a smaller group waves the old tricolor flag, their voices hoarse with calls for unity under anything that isn't Bolshevik rule. In the middle is an uneasy no-man's land of curious onlookers, shifting from foot to foot, unsure which way to lean. The propaganda machines on both sides work overtime. Red posters show heroic workers raising hammers against shadowy capitalist monsters. White leaflets warn that Bolshevik rule means anarchy, famine, and the death of tradition. You see one handbill that sums it up unintentionally, a crude drawing of two men wrestling, neither side quite winning. That's the Civil War in miniature, messy, exhausting, and impossible to predict. Then come the shortages. The fighting cuts rail lines, blocks ports, and turns farmland into battlefields. Prices jump daily. Bread feels heavier in your hand, not because it's bigger, but because you know it might be the last loaf you get for a week. People hide valuables not from burglars, but from whichever side happens to control the street that day. Soldiers, sometimes Reds, sometimes Whites, knock on doors demanding donations for the cause. You learn quickly that refusal isn't wise. One night, as you cross the Troitsky Bridge, you see the black water below, broken by chunks of ice. drifting toward the Gulf of Finland. On the far bank, a red patrol is hauling a man from his cart, rifling through sacks of potatoes. You can't hear the words, but the body language says enough. On the opposite side of the river, white forces have set up a checkpoint with equal zeal checking wagons for weapons pamphlets or simply anything they feel like taking. You start to notice the way people look at each other now, not quite with open suspicion, but with a new sharp caution. Is this neighbor a red sympathizer? Is that cousin secretly helping the whites? Friendships thin out like the bread conversations clipped to safe topics. Even the weather feels complicit, the sky hanging low and gray over a city tearing itself in two. And yet, there's a strange energy in it all. For some, this is the first time they feel they have a say in anything, even if that say is shouted across barricades. For others, it's the last gasp of a world they knew, and they're fighting tooth and nail to preserve it. You stand in the middle, the mud sucking at your boots, the banners snapping overhead, and you realize this isn't about choosing the winning side. It's about surviving long enough to see which side is left standing at all. The first time you hear it, it's just to knock 3 sharp raps at your neighbor's door in the middle of the night. You think maybe it's a drunken friend or a soldier come home late. But then you hear voices low, clipped official. Boots scrape on the floorboards. A chair tips over. And then silence, except for the steady march of those boots fading into the street. In the morning, your neighbor's door stands open, the apartment empty, except for the smell of cold tea and overturned bedding. This is the Cheka's work, the Bolsheviks' new secret police officially called the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. That's a mouthful, so everyone just calls them the Cheka, and the name itself quickly becomes enough to chill a room. The mainstream historical fact founded in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka operated without judicial oversight, with powers to arrest, interrogate, and execute on the spot. They weren't shy about using those powers. The quirky tidbit early Cheka offices often had a red flag draped over the front desk, not just for decoration, but as a kind of psychological theater. Visitors were made to stand in front of it, while questioned, the idea being that the flag itself was silently judging them. Historians still argue whether the Cheka's reign of fear was a necessary evil in a fragile revolutionary state, or a betrayal of the revolution's own ideals from day one. On the ground, it doesn't feel like philosophy. It feels like someone flipping a switch on the street lamp outside your window and plunging the block into darkness. By day, you see their posters, stern proclamations about rooting out enemies of the people, saboteurs, counter-revolutionaries. The definition of enemy shifts constantly. Yesterday it was former Tsarist officers. Today it's Mensheviks. Tomorrow it might be the merchant who sold bread at the wrong price. You hear stories of grain hoarders shot on the spot, of workers arrested for speculation because they traded extra boots for sugar. At night, the city's rhythm changes. Doors stay bolted, windows covered. A horse's hooves in the street might mean nothing, or it might mean a cart with prisoners, its wheels squeaking under the weight. You try to sleep, but every creak in the hallway sends your heart into your throat. One evening, you pass a queue outside a small building with frosted windows. People clutch papers, shifting from foot to foot. These are the lucky ones. They've been summoned for questioning, not arrest. Inside, you glimpse a desk piled high with files, a map of the city marked with colored pins. Somewhere in those stacks might be your name or someone you know. The fear isn't just about the Cheka taking you. It's about the way they hollow out trust. You start wondering if the man selling cabbages at the corner is an informant. You wonder why your friend suddenly avoids you in the street. And you wonder, most of all, whether keeping your head down is enough to keep it attached to your shoulders. Still, there are moments that jar you into realizing how absurd it can all be. A woman in your building whispers that she was interrogated for hours because her cat had been seen prowling near a grain storehouse. Apparently, someone decided it was a signal. She swears the only thing her cat signals for is milk, but the Cheka wasn't laughing. On a cold morning, you watch a column of prisoners marched through the snow toward the train station. Men and women in mismatched coats, some with hats pulled low, others bareheaded in the wind. They don't look like villains. They look like neighbors. The crowd on the sidewalk stays silent, except for one old man who mutters something under his breath. You can't tell if it's a prayer or a curse. And then the column turns the corner, the sound of boots fading, and life resumes, if you can call it that. The street vendors open their stalls, children kick at the slush, the tram rattles past, as though nothing has happened. That's how it works. The Cheka takes someone, and the city swallows the absence, tucking it into the same quiet place, where everyone hides their own fear. In this new Petrograd, you don't measure safety by whether the streets are calm. You measure it by whether the knocks on doors belong to someone you know, or to the ones you pray never come. The thaw has come, but it doesn't bring relief. Just the stink of mud rotting straw and the faint sourness of spoiled grain. You leave the city for the countryside, hoping for a break from the tension of Petrograd's alleys, but out here, the air feels heavier. The villages are quiet fields patchy with weeds. Where you expect to hear the thump of threshing or the creak of wagon wheels, you hear nothing at all. The mainstream historical fact. By 1921, Russia was gripped by famine that killed millions. War communism. Lenin's policy of grain requisitioning to feed the Red Army and cities meant armed detachments swept through the countryside, taking whatever they found. This wasn't polite tax collection. It was men with rifles loading carts until barns stood empty. The quirky tidbit: in some areas, peasants buried their grain in iron cauldrons under vegetable gardens, planting potatoes on top to hide the disturbed soil. Sometimes the Cheka found them anyway by stabbing the ground with metal rods until they heard the dull ring of a cauldron lid. Historians still argue whether the famine was primarily the fault of policy or an unavoidable byproduct of civil war and drought. But as you stand in a field where last year's harvest should be knee-high by now, it feels less like an accident and more like a slow, deliberate unmaking. You walk past a barn where the doors hang open, straw scattered like someone spilled a box of matches. Inside, the air smells of dust and emptiness. A single chicken flutters out startled, and you almost laugh at the absurdity. It's the only living thing for miles. The villagers who remain are gaunt, their faces weathered beyond their years. They don't waste words. Every syllable costs energy they don't have. In the town square, a requisitioning team stands beside a wagon stacked with sacks. The men are armed, their coats dusted with the flour that spills from untied seams. You see a woman arguing, her voice hoarse, clutching a child's thin wrist. One of the soldiers waves her off, and she steps back, not defeated exactly, but calculating. You get the sense she'll hide the next harvest better. The markets are surreal. A man is trading a brass samovar for a loaf of bread. Another offers a stack of family photographs for a jar of millet. Money means almost nothing here. Food is the only currency worth having. You catch the smell of boiled nettles from a nearby shack supper for someone who used to own 5 cows. That night, you stay in a farmhouse where the wind whistles through the gaps in the shutters. Your host serves black bread so dense it could be used as a doorstop, along with a thin beet soup. You eat slowly, knowing there's no second helping. In the quiet, you hear him muttering about the revolution's promises, how land to the peasants became land stripped bare, how the soldiers who once claimed to fight for the people now take from them without shame. In the morning, you walk to the edge of the fields, The earth here is dark and rich, Russia's famous black soil, but it lies idle, waiting for hands that are too busy hiding from soldiers to plant anything. Somewhere far off, you hear a wagon, the creak of its wheels, followed by the sharp crack of a whip. As you turn back toward the village, you spot a boy kneeling in the dirt, scraping at the ground with a tin spoon. At first, you think he's digging for roots to eat, but then you realize he's unearthing something wrapped in cloth. He glances up, eyes wary, then quickly buries it again. You pretend not to see. Out here, you don't ask questions you don't want answered. And in that moment, it hits you. The famine isn't just about empty stomachs. It's about the way hunger changes everything, how it warps trust, reshapes priorities, and turns survival into a skill sharper than any plow blade. In the cities, people talk about ideals about the future. Out here, the only future anyone can imagine is the next meal, if it comes at all. The wind off the Gulf of Finland is knife cold, cutting through your coat no matter how tightly you pull it around you. Out on the ice, you see dark shapes, men moving in formation, rifles slung over their shoulders, breath clouding in the pale air. You're in Kronstadt, the naval fortress just beyond Petrograd, and the sailors here are restless. These aren't counter-revolutionaries in the way the Bolsheviks like to paint their enemies. Just a few years ago, these same sailors were hailed as the pride and glory of the revolution, their mutiny against the Tsar's officers in 1917, a spark that helped ignite Bolshevik power. But now, in March 1921, they're out here on frozen water, demanding the revolution live up to its own promises. The mainstream historical fact: the Kronstadt sailors rose against the Bolsheviks, calling for free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech and press for workers and peasants, and an end to grain requisitioning. The quirky tidbit: their demands were written down on a sheet of paper that, according to one story, was nailed to a post in the snow like a message in a bottle for anyone brave enough to read. Historians still argue whether Kronstadt was a last gasp of revolutionary idealism or a dangerous threat to Bolshevik survival. But here, with the fortress looming behind you and the ice groaning underfoot, it feels more like betrayal's bitter aftertaste. You walk among the sailors as they huddle around makeshift fires. The flames snap in the wind, sending sparks spinning into the white expanse. Some of the men are barely out of their teens, their cheeks raw from the cold, their boots patched with scraps of canvas. They speak with the clipped urgency of people who know time isn't on their side. "We fought for freedom," one says, "not for another czar in a different hat." The Bolsheviks in Petrograd waste no time branding them traitors. The newspapers print venom. The Cheka readies its files. You hear rumors of Red Army units massing on the shore, of artillery brought in under cover of night. The ice between here and the mainland is both a shield and a trap, thick enough to march across, thin enough to swallow the careless. When the assault comes, it's sudden and brutal. You watch dark lines of troops advancing across the frozen gulf, their shapes wavering in through snow flurries. The defenders fire from the fortress walls, the crack of rifles echoing over the ice like splitting wood. Somewhere behind you, cannons boom, and the sound rattles in your chest. The fighting lasts days. Fires break out inside the fortress, their smoke curling into the sky like black exclamation points. You hear the whistle of shells and the sharper cries of the wounded. At night, the cold settles back in freezing blood into the snow where it falls. By the time it's over, the ice is littered with abandoned rifles, torn coats, and dark stains that the wind will soon cover. The survivors are marched away under guard, their shoulders hunched, their faces blank. You know where many of them will end up: prisons, labor camps, or shallow graves no one will mark. And yet the memory of what they demanded lingers. In Petrograd, People whisper about Kronstadt in kitchens and factory corners, lowering their voices when they mention the word freedom. Officially, it will be called a counter-revolutionary plot. Unofficially, it will be remembered as the moment even the revolution's own children dared to ask why the promises had frozen solid before the ink dried. Walking away from the fortress, you look back once. The ice stretches out behind you, smooth and white, hiding the scars beneath. But you know they're still there, just under the surface, waiting for the next thaw. The sound hits you first, a deep metallic pounding steady as a heartbeat echoing across the city. You follow it through streets laced with soot until you reach the edge of a sprawling factory complex. Inside, molten metal spits from a furnace, sparks cascading like tiny comets. The air is thick with the smell of oil, iron, and sweat. This is the new Soviet dream made solid, the first 5-year plan under Joseph Stalin, where progress is measured not in comfort, but in output. The mainstream historical fact. Launched in 1928, Stalin's first 5-year plan aimed to turn the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse in record time. Steel production was to triple, coal output to double, and new cities would spring up almost overnight. The quirky tidbit. Some factory workers joked that the slogan, 5-year plan in 4 years, meant 4 years without sleep. Historians still argue whether the plan's breakneck pace was visionary modernization or reckless human sacrifice. Standing here among the clanging presses and the roar of turbines, it's easy to feel both. You wander through a workshop where men in grease-stained overalls bend over lathes, their faces lit by the glow of welding arcs. The noise is constant, a kind of industrial weather you can't escape. Production quotas hang from the walls, each number higher than the last, as if ambition alone could stretch the day beyond 24 hours. In the towns built around these plants, life is just as relentless. Apartment blocks rise in grids, their windows blinking in the smoky haze. Food queues wrap around the corner before dawn. By noon, the bread is gone. You pass a woman hauling 2 buckets of coal, her boots sinking into the mud churned by endless foot traffic. She doesn't stop to talk, nobody does. Every minute lost is a quota missed, and a missed quota means questions from the party. One day you visit Magnitogorsk, a city built almost from scratch in the Ural Mountains to feed the steel mills. The streets smell of fresh-cut timber from the new housing, but also of raw sewage. The infrastructure hasn't caught up to the population. Workers sleep in barracks or in dugouts carved into the hillside. They work 12-hour shifts, then spend their free time building the city they're supposed to live in. There's pride here, certainly. You see it in the man who shows you a gleaming steel beam and says it will be part of a bridge strong enough to last 100 years. You see it in the teenage girl who runs a lathe like she was born to it, her hair tucked under a scarf. But there's exhaustion, too, stamped into faces, like the marks on the factory's output logs. Propaganda posters plaster the walls, workers smiling beside gleaming machines, tractors cutting perfect rows across golden fields. Out in the countryside, those tractors are often broken or still waiting to arrive. Collectivization. Stalin's companion policy to industrialization has driven peasants from their land into these factories, sometimes willingly, often not. You remember the famine scars from the villages, and now you see where the people have gone into the smoke, into the shift rotations, into the statistics. The pace is merciless. A worker named Alexei tells you about Uderniki, the shock workers who push past quotas for glory and party favor. His smile is thin when he says it. He knows the rest of the shift will have to match that impossible pace or face punishment. In the lunchroom, really, just a drafty shed, men and women eat black bread and cabbage soup in silence, conserving their energy. Then there's the Stakhanovite movement, named after a miner who allegedly mined over 14 times his quota in one shift. Officially, it's an inspiring story. Unofficially, people mutter that it's staged and that real workers collapse long before such numbers are reached. One evening, you step outside the plant and see the sun setting through a haze so thick it turns the sky copper. The ground trembles faintly with the weight of machinery still running inside. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle blows, end of shift for some, beginning for others. The cycle never stops. And you realize that in Stalin's Soviet Union, progress is not something you measure in comfort or in leisure or even in safety. It's measured in tons of steel meters of cloth kilowatts of power, numbers that look impressive on paper, but in the flesh, taste of coal dust and fatigue. You breathe it in, and it scratches at your throat like a warning. You start noticing the absences before you can name the pattern. A chair left pulled out in a communal kitchen. A coat that used to hang on a peg gone without a goodbye. The factory foreman who shouted about quotas yesterday, replaced today by a man with a rounder hat and a thinner smile. The city hums the way it always does. Metal-pounding trams rattling, but between the beats there's a hush, as if the air itself is holding its breath. The posters never mention fear. They talk about vigilance. They talk about enemies burrowing like beetles into the bark of the people's tree. The phrase of the season is unmasking, and you feel it brushing your cheeks like a cold hand as you walk home. The mainstream historical fact by 1936-1938. What later gets called the Great Terror is in full swing show trials broadcast. Like grim theater NKVD arrest quotas set by region, hundreds of thousands arrested. Many executed, more sent to camps. Streets you know by heart become maps of vanished acquaintances. The quirky tidbit, people start sleeping with a small suitcase, the emergency bundle by the door, a toothbrush, a spare shirt, a crust of bread, documents folded and refolded until the creases look permanent. It's not optimism. It's logistics. If the knock comes at 2 a.m., you don't want to make the secret police wait while you hunt for socks. Historians still argue whether the terror is purely a top-down machine calibrated by Stalin's hand, or if it grows fungus-like from local rivalries and denunciations feeding the center what it wants to hear. From where you sit on the edge of your bed, shoes still on, the distinction doesn't help you sleep. The hallway outside smells of cabbage boiled and overboiled and of damp wool. Every footstep is a premonition. You learn new etiquette. You do not ask about someone who has gone away. You do not keep a photograph where an awkward extra might later be identified as an enemy. If you must keep the photograph, you trim the edge with careful scissors. And when your neighbor notices the ragged margin, you shrug and say the frame was too small. You laugh, but not too loudly. You remember the Finland station and the chalk line Lenin once insisted on. Now you draw your own border lines between thought and speech, between what you know and what you pretend not to. At work, a notice goes up, a meeting tonight, attendance required. You go, of course. You sit on a hard chair under a portrait that watches with patient eyes. The secretary clears his throat and names a colleague, a quiet, meticulous man who used to bring birch twig brooms from his village as gifts, now revealed as a wrecker. The word tastes like metal in your mouth. A murmur ripples the room. Then comes the part that you dread, testimonies. The ritual is oddly like the factory line you left an hour ago. Each person adds a piece, a detail shaved to fit the narrative. He once left a window open in winter. He questioned a quota. He failed to applaud vigorously enough. You speak to nothing sharp, nothing that will be quoted later, just enough to be seen. You feel like someone's signing for a package you didn't order. Outside the city plays a parallel theater. The newspapers run the show trials like serialized epics, former Bolshevik heroes in glass boxes confessing crimes that spiral from plausible to baroque. You stand in a crowd and listen to a radio crackle through the verdict. No one gasps. No one cheers. Faces are still as if carved from the same wood used for the judge's bench. Later in whispers, someone says the accused looked relieved when the sentence came, like a man who's finally reached the end of a long, narrowing hallway. You keep your head down, but the absences keep multiplying. The poet who recited in kitchens to audiences of 8 gone. The theater director who dared to stage a play about conscience arrested. A violinist whose bow seemed to float, transferred, then never mentioned again. You see Shostakovich's name in a paper scolded for muddle instead of music, and you imagine him sleeping in the stairwell with a packed suitcase, so his wife won't have to watch the nightmen take him. You picture the suitcase by the door again, that toothbrush clicking against tin. You also picture packing snacks, because if you're going to be terrified, you might as well be terrified and not hungry. Humor is allowed here, but only in your head. Then the rumor reaches even your cautious building the generals are being replaced. Replaced is a generous verb. You hear of Tukhachevsky, brilliant Severe, swept off the chessboard with others in the high command. The army's shoulders hunch a little after that, as if trying to make itself smaller under the portrait's gaze. The newspapers insist that the rot went deep, that the knife had to go deeper still. You nod at the words because nodding is a muscle memory now. But you tuck away a private doubt the way the boy in the famine tucked away his little wrapped parcel under the soil. Of all the disappearances, the strangest are the vanishing acts performed after the fact. Photographs change like weather. You leaf through a magazine and notice Trotsky in one image, then flip a few pages and see the same scene, but tighter, as if the camera had taken a step to the right. Trotsky is gone. The gap smoothed with careful retouching a fingernail of someone's hand, left floating near a sleeve. Later, even Yezhov, the security chief who stands beaming beside Stalin at the Moscow-Volga Canal, will fade from the official image, the water lapping where he used to be. It's a new kind of diet, fewer calories, fewer comrades. A friend pulls you into a stairwell and hisses that her cousin was taken because a co-worker denounced him for hoarding nails. Nails. In a country inhaling steel dust, the accusation sticks. You think of Section 8's factories, remember that whistle that marked the end of one shift and the start of another. And you wonder how many denunciations were filed between those two blasts. You also wonder if anyone has denounced the dust. Counter-revolutionary behavior settling on lungs without a party card. The jokes that survive are short-barbed and told only under blankets. Why do you applaud so long? Because I don't know if I'm the last one to stop. You chuckle in your throat, a sound half cough, half prayer. It feels like tapping the ice around Kronstadt with the toe of your boot, testing for cracks before taking another step. Someone you love tells you they've been invited to speak at a meeting, nothing serious, just a small committee asking questions about their field. You smile, say it's an honor fuss about their tie. And then you help them pack the toothbrush. The knock may not come. Most nights pass with only the radiator knocking like a polite ghost. But the ritual keeps your nerves from fraying into thread. One morning, you notice the blank space in a team photograph tacked above the punch clock. A jagged edge, a too clean sky. You press your thumb to the ragged paper and close your eyes. The city soundtrack continues. The factory heartbeats, the tram bells, the distant boots that might be a patrol or might be a delivery. Progress still roars because numbers must be met. Plans must be completed in 4 years, sleep be damned. But the melody underneath is quieter. The sibilant hush of names being rubbed out, syllable by syllable, until even their echoes feel nervous. You keep walking. You master the art of greeting portraits as if they were doormen. You measure your sentences like cloth during a shortage. And when you pass the river where the ice once hid its scars, you think it's summer now. And we can see the water, but it still carries what it carried then, only deeper. The library smells of glue and dust, the kind that clings to paper like it's trying to keep history pinned in place. You slide a heavy volume from the shelf, its red cloth cover worn smooth at the corners, and let it fall open. Something's off. The page numbers skip. A paragraph you remember reading last year is gone, replaced by a cheerier version. Where once a date stood 1918, it now says 1917. And the explanation feels like an afterthought. You're holding one of the quietest weapons in the Soviet arsenal, the rewritten textbook. The mainstream historical fact under Stalin, the rewriting of history became systematic. Figures like Trotsky, Bukharin, and even early allies of Lenin were erased from official accounts. Schoolchildren learned a history in which Stalin's role was always central. His foresight unmatched, his leadership inevitable. The quirky tidbit. Some textbooks were corrected not with new print runs, but by literally pasting fresh pages over old ones. Students could sometimes peel them back like scabs to glimpse the banned original underneath. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated long-term strategy to mold generations or a byproduct of Stalin's obsession with control in the present. Either way, you can see the effects in real time. A boy at the next table is copying notes in careful block letters. Lenin and Stalin led the October Revolution. His pencil doesn't even hesitate. You flip through the book again and find an old photograph of a meeting hall. Once Trotsky stood at the podium in this very shot, gesturing as the crowd leaned in. Now in the new edition, the podium is empty, as if the room was waiting politely for Stalin to arrive. The retouching is good, but not perfect. The edge of Trotsky's sleeve is still there, like a ghost who hasn't learned how to leave. Outside the library, the city is plastered with posters that double as historical lessons. In them, Stalin appears beside Lenin in moments you know he wasn't actually present for on the armored train in 1917, in strategy meetings that were once just Lenin and Trotsky. The images are vivid, bold, and hung low enough for schoolchildren to point at. You walk past a schoolyard and hear a group of kids playing a clapping game with a chant Lenin thought Stalin brought. The people bred, the people fought. They giggle at the rhythm, not realizing they're reciting a compressed, sanitized version of the past. At home, your neighbor shows you her revised biography of Lenin. The new chapter about Stalin's role is so glowing it could light a dark hallway. She whispers, "I kept the old edition," then quickly changes the subject. You don't ask where she hides it. In these years, possessing the wrong book can weigh heavier than a sack of grain. Even museums aren't safe from the scissors. You visit one where the portraits on the wall have been rearranged. A gap in the sequence is explained away as space for a future work. The guide's voice doesn't waver, but you notice her eyes skip the blank wall quickly, like a driver ignoring a pothole. In the newspapers, anniversaries are opportunities for editing. The latest piece on the October Revolution reads like a script in which Stalin's part has been doubled. His speeches move to key turning points, his advice always the decisive factor. You think back to the Finland station, to that first electric moment when Lenin arrived. No mention of it now without Stalin in the wings nodding wisely in imagined approval. The strangest part isn't the deletions, it's how quickly people adapt. In casual conversation, dates shift, names drop away, anecdotes reshape themselves to fit the official story. A man you know once told you with a chuckle how Trotsky outmaneuvered an opponent in debate. Now he swears it was Stalin's cleverness all along. Maybe he believes it. Maybe it's safer if he does. One evening, you open your own small box of keepsakes, a few letters, a faded snapshot of a rally in 1917, a pamphlet with Trotsky's name on the cover. You hold them longer than you mean to tracing the ink with your finger. You think about hiding them somewhere less obvious. You think about burning them. And then you hear it, someone on the radio reading a passage from the latest school text. The words are slow and careful, the tone warm. From the earliest days, Comrade Stalin was the guiding star of the revolution. You realize you're hearing not just a rewriting of the past, but a rehearsal for the future. The line between history and memory has been stitched and restitched until you can't tell where the scene began. When the broadcast ends, the room feels smaller. You close the box, push it to the back of the shelf, and pour yourself tea. The steam curls upward, soft and fleeting, the way a true memory rises, brief, uncatchable, and gone, if you don't breathe it in fast enough. The laboratory smells faintly of ozone and boiled cloth, the kind of air that comes from too many electrical experiments and too few open windows. You're standing in a room where glass tubes gleam under dim bulbs, and the men and women in lab coats look more like they're bracing for winter than making history scarves tucked in tight gloves, with the fingertips cut off so that they can still scribble notes. The mainstream historical fact: the Soviet Union poured enormous resources into science and technology, especially projects that could prove the superiority of socialism, space research, industrial chemistry, military innovation. But science here always bent under the weight of ideology. The quirky tidbit: some official experiments had such political overtones that even plants got propaganda names like wheat varieties nicknamed Stalinets to inspire loyalty in the fields as well as the factories. Historians still argue whether Soviet science flourished because of central planning or in spite of it. In this lab, it feels like both. You see brilliant minds working under constant pressure to produce results that match the party line, not just reality. One young physicist shows you a sheaf of calculations, lowering his voice to say, "The numbers are wrong, but the conclusion is right." So the numbers will change. You can't tell if it's sarcasm or survival. The contradictions are everywhere. On one side of the building, engineers are sketching designs for a turbine that might power entire cities. On the other, a team is perfecting a new type of armored vehicle. Both projects will be unveiled with the same rhetoric, proof of Soviet genius, proof of Stalin's wisdom. Outside, a delivery cart rattles by loaded with sacks for the Gulag workshops, where prisoners will mine the metals or stitch the uniforms needed to make these blueprints real. You meet a biologist who once studied at a German university. His office is lined with dusty microscopes and jars of preserved specimens, but his current work isn't on bacteria. It's on politically reliable agricultural theories. You've heard of this before: Trofim Lysenko's ideas about plant genetics, which reject Mendelian inheritance in favor of politically pleasing vernalization methods. Officially, these theories promise miraculous crop yields. Unofficially, they risk famine if they fail. The biologist doesn't say which side he's on. He just points to a poster on the wall that reads, "Science must serve the people," in shrugs. Some projects are kept in deep secrecy. A chemist tells you in a whisper about special laboratories where prisoners are forced to work on everything from new medicines to poisons. They're called sharashkas, closed research facilities under the watch of the NKVD. The irony isn't lost on you. Brilliant minds stripped of freedom, tasked with creating the technologies that will keep the prison system running. You pass through a testing yard where a hulking prototype tank squats like some prehistoric beast. Its metal skin is cold to the touch, rivets big as your thumb. The engineer in charge beams as he explains how it will roll over the enemies of socialism. You nod, but your eyes drift to the workers shoveling coal into the furnace. Nearby thin men in ragged coats who look like they've been shoveling since the last ice age. In the city, science is paraded like a prize stallion. Radio broadcasts, trumpet breakthroughs, exhibitions display gleaming models of tractors and airplanes. School children are taught to idolize inventors alongside generals, to see chemistry as patriotic duty and engineering as a battlefield. You walk past a billboard showing a rocket arcing toward the stars, even though the real launch pads are still swamps. But beneath the fanfare, you sense the tightrope every scientist walks. Get the results the party wants, and you'll be celebrated. Get the wrong results, or worse, question the right ones, and you'll be reassigned, demoted, or vanished into a camp. Sometimes the camps themselves become laboratories. The line between innovation and punishment is as thin as a filament wire. One evening, you share tea with a mathematician who's been working on ballistics calculations. He jokes, "Every time my equations work, someone dies faster. Every time they don't, I might." His smile is tired, but there's no bitterness, just the weary acceptance of someone who knows his brilliance is both the reason he's valued and the reason he's never safe. As you leave the lab, you glance back through the frosted windows. Inside, a group of scientists huddles over a table, their breath fogging in the cold. They look like conspirators, but they're only trying to solve an engineering problem before morning. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows. And you think about how knowledge here is like electricity, capable of lighting the city or burning it down, depending on who's at the switch. The wind in Siberia doesn't so much blow as it gnaws, finding seams in your coat you didn't know existed, biting through wool like it's tissue paper. You're standing at the edge of a labor camp, one of hundreds, scattered across the frozen vastness, where the snow crunches underfoot with a sound like breaking glass. The sky is white on white. So flat and featureless, it makes you feel like you've wandered into the inside of a blank page. The mainstream historical fact: the Gulag system imprisoned millions of criminals, political dissidents, unlucky bystanders, forcing them into brutal labor in mines, logging sites, rail projects, and factories. The quirky tidbit: prisoners sometimes made playing cards out of birch bark, using soot and bits of cloth dye. For the suits, a tiny rebellion against the monotony of their days. Historians still argue whether the Gulag was primarily a punishment system or an economic engine designed to fuel Soviet industry. Standing here, your breath crystallizing in the air, it feels like both a machine that grinds people down while feeding the state's hunger for resources. The gates are rough timber rimmed with barbed wire. Inside, barracks squat low against the wind, their windows filmed over with frost from the breath of dozens of men crammed into each room. You step into one and the heat hits you wet, stale, almost suffocating, but it's not comfort. The stoves burn low, fed with whatever scraps of wood the day's labor hasn't already claimed. The air smells of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and a thin cabbage soup that simmers in a dented pot. Men sit on bunks stacked 3 high, their faces a map of frostbite scars, hollow cheeks, and eyes that have learned not to linger on strangers. A few are mending boots with strips of cloth, others just stare at the wall. You nod, but nobody asks your name. Out here, knowing less about each other is a kind of protection. Work begins before dawn. You follow a column out into the darkness, the snow squealing under boots. Today's job is felling trees for a logging project. The axes are dull, the handles splintered. Every swing sends a shock up your arms, every breath burns your lungs. The guards bark orders, their rifles slung casually, as if the forest itself might try to escape. The hours stretch in a blur of white and gray. A man near you coughs until he doubles over, but when he tries to straighten, his knees buckle. 2 others help him up, but the guards wave them on. Production can't wait. You think of Section 8's factories, their relentless quotas, and realize the logic here is the same, only the walls are made of snow instead of brick. At midday, you huddle around a fire made from branches too twisted for lumber. Someone passes a chunk of bread hard as wood. You gnaw at it slowly, letting the ice in your beard melt just enough to swallow. Across the flames, a prisoner pulls a tiny deck of birch bark cards from his pocket. For a moment, faces soften. They deal hands, muttering rules to a game they all seem to know, and the firelight turns their breath into gold mist. The return march is slower. The cold is sharper now, the kind that makes your eyelashes stick together. By the time you reach the barracks, your fingers are stiff inside your gloves. The evening meal is another bowl of soup, this one thinner than the morning's, and a ladle of kasha that tastes faintly of sawdust. In the dim light, someone hums a tune, quiet, almost embarrassed. You can't place the melody, but it's not a revolutionary anthem. It sounds older, a scrap of something from before all this. The humming fades when a guard passes by the door. You lie on your bunk, the wood pressing against your shoulder blades, and stare at the rafters. The wind howls through the cracks like it's searching for someone. Sleep comes in fits, broken by the coughs, the shifting of bodies, the occasional muttered word. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle blows, maybe from another camp, maybe from the railway, that carries both supplies and prisoners deeper into the white. Here winter is not a season, it's a sentence, and you feel it settling into your bones, cold and heavy, the way history does when it's not written down, but lived in the body. The snow in Moscow this winter is thin, patchy, trampled into gray crust by boots that seem to march everywhere. But the air is heavy with something else, the steady drumbeat of war. It's 1941, and you can feel the city holding its breath. On the radio, Molotov's voice is flat as stone Germany has invaded. The Great Patriotic War has begun. The mainstream historical fact Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was the largest military invasion in history, catching the Soviet Union unprepared despite warnings. Entire divisions were encircled, millions of soldiers killed or captured in the opening months. The quirky tidbit Moscow shop windows were hastily painted over not just for blackout protection, but to hide luxury goods from soldiers passing through an attempt to avoid bad morale optics. Historians still argue whether Stalin's early inaction came from disbelief, strategic miscalculation, or sheer political paralysis. In the streets, none of that matters. You hear the same word over and over, mobilizatsiya, and you watch it swallow men whole. You see them at the stations, soldiers in quilted jackets, rifles slung, faces still carrying the softness of home. Families press close, whispering last-minute advice. The whistle blows, the train lurches, and the platform empties in seconds, leaving only steam and a few damp handkerchiefs. In the factories, the noise redoubles. Machines run around the clock making rifles, shells, tank parts. You remember the 5-year plan's endless quotas and realize it was training for the steel over comfort numbers, over sleep. The air tastes of metal filings and cigarette smoke. Women in headscarves work the laths, now their hands quick and sure. Then the front reaches closer. Refugees stream in from the west, dragging carts piled with blankets, kettles, children clinging to the edges. They bring stories, whole towns, burned crops, torched executions carried out in barnyards. You hear the words Babi Yar before you fully understand what they mean, and your stomach turns cold in a way the air alone can't manage. Moscow digs in. Anti-tank trenches gouge the frozen earth around the city. Street signs are taken down to confuse the enemy. You walk past the Kremlin at night, its towers painted over in camouflage patterns, the golden stars switched off to hide them from bombers. On some corners, sandbags stack higher than your head. On others, volunteers with rifles peer into the darkness, their breath forming little clouds of defiance. When the air raids come, you hear the sirens first, a rising wail that shreds your nerves. You grab your coat and while run for the shelter, feeling the ground tremble as bombs fall somewhere too close to gas. In the dim underground, people sit shoulder to shoulder, the smell of damp stone and fear clinging to the walls. Someone mutters a joke about free heating courtesy of the Luftwaffe, and a few people laugh, quiet, tired laughs that die as quickly as they start. The Red Army's orders are ruthless. Not one step back. You hear about blocking detachments units tasked with shooting any soldier who retreats without orders. At the same time, you hear about partisans fighters hidden in the forests, blowing up rail lines, ambushing German patrols. One man tells you with a strange grin that they once tied logs across a road painted to look like artillery barrels, just to make a convoy turn back. The winter of 1941-42 is brutal. On the front line, frostbite eats through fingers and toes before bullets ever find them. In the city, rations shrink 400 grams of bread a day for workers, less for others. The bread is half sawdust now, but you eat it anyway, chewing until your jaw aches. You remember the famine years and know that hunger has a long memory in this country. When the tide finally begins to turn, first at Moscow, then more decisively at Stalingrad, it's not triumph you feel so much as exhaustion. The cost is everywhere, in the empty seats at dinner tables, in the photographs tucked inside coats, in the long lists printed in the paper. You pass a wall where names of the dead are posted, and a woman traces a finger over one, before turning away her eyes, dry, her mouth set. The war is far from over, but already its clear victory will not mean a return to what was. The machinery of the state has grown stronger under fire, its grip tighter. Even in the shelters, you notice portraits on the walls, not saints or icons, but Stalin watching with that fixed, unreadable gaze. You walk home one night under a sky finally clear of bombers. The streets are dark, the air biting, but you can hear the sound of distant trains carrying more men, more steel, more the future toward the front. Somewhere far away, that future is being bought, hour by hour, bullet by bullet, life by life. And here in the shadowed city, you keep walking, the war humming in your bones. The war ends not with silence, but with noise cheers and red square brass bands, blaring victory marches, the sharp crack of celebratory gunfire echoing off the Kremlin walls. In May 1945, the Soviet Union stands bloodied, but unbroken, its flag planted in the ruins of Berlin. On paper, it's triumph on a scale few nations can imagine. In the streets, it's something messier, half relief, half the stunned quiet of people who've walked back from the edge and aren't sure where they've landed. The mainstream historical fact: the USSR lost an estimated 27 million people during the Second World War. Whole towns disappeared, infrastructure lay in rubble, and yet Stalin emerged not just as the undisputed leader at home, but as one of the world's superpowers abroad. The quirky tidbit in Moscow's 1945 victory parade captured German banners were thrown down in Red Square, so many that some soldiers later admitted they could barely keep from tripping over them. Historians still argue whether the post-war Soviet system was a logical extension of wartime centralization or a conscious tightening of an already iron grip. On the ground, it feels like the war never really ended, just changed uniforms. Factories roar back to life almost immediately, but not for consumer goods. Instead of radios and bicycles, the assembly lines turn out tanks, artillery, and the new darling of Soviet military pride, jet aircraft. You wander through the same industrial yards from the 5-year plan days, and see them expanded, modernized, humming, with a purpose you can't eat or wear. Civilian housing is slow to appear. The government calls it a temporary inconvenience. In the countryside, victory hasn't brought prosperity. Soldiers return to find their villages stripped of young men, livestock, and sometimes even roofs. Collectivization rolls on now with the added pressure of rebuilding the motherland. You see women driving tractors through fields still pockmarked with shell craters, the plow blades occasionally catching on rusted shrapnel. Cities wear their scars, openly bombed out buildings repurposed as storage streets patched with mismatched cobblestones. Yet, the propaganda machine paints a picture of unstoppable recovery. Billboards show smiling families in brand new apartments, even if most people are still queuing for bread and living 3 to a room. On the radio, a deep voice insists that life is better. Comrades, life is more joyful. You glance around the tram and see no one smiling. The culture tightens too. In wartime, music, art, and literature were occasionally given leeway if they boosted morale. Now socialist realism returns in full force, no ambiguity, no shadows, just heroic workers and benevolent leaders. A play you enjoyed before the war is now rewritten so that the plucky young protagonist ends each act by praising Stalin. You stop going to the theater. In schools, children wear their young pioneer scarves, proudly reciting lessons that blend recent history with ideological purity. The war is retold in simple lines. The party led. The people followed. Victory was inevitable. You think of the nights in 1941 when inevitability felt like a cruel joke, but you keep that thought to yourself. Even the military victory has its shadows. Veterans with missing limbs beg quietly near the metro, their medals tucked away because too much visible suffering doesn't fit the victory narrative. Some are moved to remote facilities for care. You never see them again. A friend who fought at Kursk tells you he feels more invisible now than he did in the trenches. The geopolitical stage changes too. Soviet troops remained in Eastern Europe not just as liberators, but as occupiers. Satellite states form like a chain across the map. And the Iron Curtain, though Churchill hasn't coined the phrase yet, feels tangible. You overhear a railway worker joke that the trains east of Berlin now run on Moscow time whether the clocks agree or not. You attend a parade marking another anniversary of victory. The air smells faintly of exhaust from the tanks rolling through the square, their treads leaving perfect imprints in the wet pavement. Above, aircraft fly in precise formation, their engines thrumming like an industrial symphony. The crowd claps on cue, cheers on cue, falls silent on cue. You notice how often eyes flick toward the reviewing stand where Stalin stands in his white marshal's uniform, expression as fixed as the statues that already bear his likeness. The war is over, yes, but the state of siege never lifts. The slogans shift from beat the fascists to defend against the imperialists. Rationing lingers. Surveillance hums along like background static. And in the pauses between official speeches, you catch the private conversations of neighbors wondering if peace will ever feel like peace, or if it's just another uniform over the same body. You walk home through streets that should feel freer now, but instead carry the weight of discipline learned too well in wartime stand where you're told, say what's safe, keep marching. Somewhere far off beyond the reach of the city's floodlights, the next front is already being drawn. The first thing you notice is how still everything feels. Not quiet. There's always the rattle of trams, the barking of dogs, the distant clang of a factory shift bell, but still as if the whole country has slipped into a kind of slow motion. It's the 1970s, and the Soviet Union is no longer the fevered, marching to quota state you saw under Stalin. It's something else. Heavy, settled, like a great stone that isn't rolling but is still far too big to move. The mainstream historical fact: this period is often called the era of stagnation. Economic growth slowed, political reforms froze, and the party leadership aged into a tight circle of men who all looked as though they'd been carved from the same tired block of granite. The quirky tidbit: in official photographs, Leonid Brezhnev's chest sometimes bore so many medals that onlookers joked he needed a second rib cage to support them. Historians still argue whether this stagnation was an inevitable byproduct of the system or the result of missed opportunities for reform. Living through it, you don't hear the debates. You just feel the drag. Shops are stocked, but unevenly. You might find a heap of pickled cabbage jars one week and nothing but empty shelves the next. People queue without asking what's being sold. If there's a line, it must be worth something. You join one out of habit only to find yourself buying 3 mismatched teacups because that's all there is. Factories still hum, but the urgency is gone. Workers meet quotas with a kind of practiced laziness, stretching tasks to fill the day, fixing machines with improvised parts because new ones never seem to arrive. You remember the intensity of the 5-year plan era and marvel at how much less noise there is now. How the sparks from the welders seem fewer and dimmer. In offices, the same faces hold the same posts year after year. Brezhnev's speeches sound interchangeable, praising steady progress and unbreakable unity in tones that suggest even he doesn't expect anyone to be thrilled. You sit through a May Day parade and notice the applause is polite, but thin, like a cough that never quite clears the throat. Yet, under the surface, something is shifting. People are beginning to push back, not with open revolt, but with small, quiet refusals. Samizdat literature typed on onion-skin paper passes hand to hand. Rock music from the West slips in on crackling cassettes. At kitchen tables, jokes have grown sharper. Why do our leaders walk so slowly so that they don't have to pass anyone? You meet a young man who spends his nights taping banned songs over state-issued cassette lectures on Marxism-Leninism. Another teaches himself English from a smuggled paperback so he can read novels the censors never touch. These are not mass uprisings, but they're seeds each one. A little act of disobedience planted in the cracks of the system. In the countryside, the collective farms limp along, many sustained more by personal garden plots than by official output. You walk past rows of potatoes grown in secret, tended with more care than the wheat fields meant for the state. A woman tells you her cabbages taste better because the government doesn't get any. She laughs, but it's a laugh with teeth. The big anniversaries still come, each one an excuse for fireworks parades and patriotic documentaries on television. But when the cameras switch off, life folds back into its gray routine. You see old men playing dominoes in the park, school children in uniforms reciting oaths they don't fully understand, shop clerks sweeping the same patch of floor for half an hour. And then in the early 1980s funerals, first Brezhnev, then Andropov, then Chernenko. 3 general secretaries in quick succession, each one buried with pomp, while the country watches with the detached calm of someone flipping channels. You hear people call it the Parade of Coffins, a gallows humor way of marking the passage of time. By the mid-1980s, new words start to drift in glasnost perestroika. They feel strange in the mouth, like fresh bread after years of the same amaz-tang stale loaf. Some embrace them, others scoff, certain nothing will change. But the old stillness has been disturbed, and that's enough to set something in motion. Looking back over the decades, the famine fields the ice of Kronstadt, the factory floors, the shadowed corridors of the Cheka, the war, the rewritten books. You realize the Soviet Union was never just one thing. It was a promise and a threat, a machine and a prison, a teacher and a thief. Now, as it edges toward its final years, it's also a giant that's starting to sway the cracks in its legs, widening with every step it tries to take. You stand in a Moscow street on a cool evening, watching the neon signs flicker on above a grocery that has nothing worth buying. People pass by, some in a hurry, some dawdling, all carrying their own private maps of the past. Somewhere in the distance, music leaks from an open window, western, faint but clear enough to recognize. The stone is still huge, still heavy, but you can feel it just barely beginning to move. And now, you can let it go. The frost on the barracks roofs the dust in the factory air, the cold gleam of metals and the soft whisper of pages being trimmed from books, it's all fading, carried away like smoke on a still night. You can hear the footsteps receding slower now until they're just a part of the background hum. Picture the streets emptying, the last tram clattering past its lights, shrinking into the dark. Somewhere a window closes against the evening chill. Somewhere else a kettle begins to boil. The banners have been folded, the speeches ended, the crowd's gone home to their small kitchens and worn tables. The giant that towered over so many lives stands quieter now, its breath shallow, its weight leaning into time. You step back further and further until it's just a shape on the horizon, softened by the distance. The air feels warmer here. So you close your eyes, let your shoulders drop, and take in one last deep breath. Whatever storms came before, they're behind you for tonight. Ahead there's only the slow rhythm of your own heartbeat, steady and calm, carrying you gently towards sleep.